Let's talk about adding agentic features to an application. One question you might be thinking to yourself, can it be done? And well, yes, it can. Another question should be, should you do it? Why should you do it? And that's another great question. So I think it's going to come down to, when do you want to add? And I think in this video, I can't answer that question perfectly for you and your needs, but I'm going to try to guide you such that you can try to answer that question for yourself. I'm going to show you a couple of examples of apps I've built that have AI agents, and I'm going to try to highlight some of my thinking and what led me to add an AI agent or not. And then hopefully that will help to guide you to then answer the question, when does it make sense, or when should you add them? And I think there will be cases where you really don't want AI agents at all, of any kind, but you may even want to borrow the ideas that are there, so to use agentic patterns. And then in other cases, you may want something to be fully autonomous. And we can see that the area of fully autonomous AI is becoming more and more buzzy and hyped. Some good examples, some not. But I think it's worth exploring. So that's what we're going to do in this video. I want to bring up something here, and that's the useful concepts that you should keep in mind whenever you're thinking about software and whenever you're thinking about AI and AI agents. So I've got 4 phrases here, and there is roughly a spectrum, not perfectly, from top to bottom. So in the top we have determinism, and that's basically when, as you would expect of course, a computer gives you the same answer all of the time. So 1 + 1 = 2. That will always be correct. The computer will always give you that answer. Unless of course you change the code and you force it to give you a different answer. But you expect the code to always give you an A + B = C sort of scenario. Now, when you have code that does that, of course, it may not be autonomous. So autonomous is whenever the code has some amount of decision making. However, whenever code has decision making power, such as through if statements or whatever, those can still be fully deterministic. So code which is deterministic may not be autonomous, and autonomous code can run by itself, but it can also still be deterministic, but it also may not be. And that's kind of leading into the bottom part of the phrases here. So something that I call agentic patterns, whenever something looks like an AI agent, but perhaps isn't quite there yet. And when I say not quite there yet, and that's because it doesn't actually let the LLM make all of the decisions. There may be a little bit in there where you call an LLM to perform some sort of function, some sort of task, but it doesn't really have the decision-making power as to whether the agent can keep going and being autonomous or whether it has to stop or come back. That's going to be the bottom part. So the bottom part is what I call fully agentic. This is what most people think about when we're talking about AI agents in this day and age, or even just agent, is one where the AI can make a decision about whether to keep going or whether to stop. So it keeps performing a loop, and then it asks the question, have I reached my goal or not? And if it hasn't reached the goal, then it keeps going. Of course, you may want to be thinking about security. You might want to say, well, please stop after every 20 steps and then have a human come back in to check. Of course, you don't have to. You could just keep telling the AI to keep going indefinitely forever and keep making decisions until it reaches the goal. So this is where we are on this kind of rough spectrum of deterministic with no autonomy, all the way up to non-determinism, but still fully automated at the other end. And I think this is, and that's what we call AI agents. This seems to be the common term. So in order to help you to answer the question of when do you add AI agents, I'm going to walk you through some of the examples of apps I've built and show you how I thought about it and give you kind of something which covers this range of concepts. It is more towards the agentic end, and hopefully that will be clear as to why I'm doing it this way. And in doing so, obviously, I hope that this will help you to answer the question, because I think you have to answer the question for yourself whether you want something to be autonomous or autonomous with some sort of AI brain, i.e. an agent. So here's my apps that have agentic features. Now, this code is all open source. It's all in GitHub. You can find it, you can download it, you can dissect it. You can even ask your LLM, your favorite LLM, to look at my code and to give it some sort of critique and to even look at some of the features. Within each of the repos, there should be documentation that will give you some insight and into how the apps function, and even how the LLM features of those apps function, or the agentic parts. So Novel Writer is an app that generates prose. So the LLM will write prose, however, all of the decision making is done by the app. It is fully deterministic, and you can choose to make it fully automated or not. So Novel Writer writes novels, which should be obvious from the name. You can click the buttons within the app one by one in order to run it. And I'm going to show you that very soon. RPG Loom is an idle RPG game. There is a little bit of LLM decision making, but again, not a lot. So it's got a little bit of an agentic feature, but it's not an AI agent really by any means. Dungeon GPT is my AI-powered dungeon master, so you're kind of playing a game of D&D where the LLM is the dungeon master, and it has some amount of agentic features, but again, it's not fully agentic. The last one, Story Demon, was designed to be fully agentic from the beginning, and that's where it does have this LLM decision-making power. So let's go through these apps. So the first one here, you have an application that guides you through writing a story, and it's using an LLM to generate the story. Some amount of the lore is deterministic, and that's created on the computer using templates and whatever else which exists in the code. However, the prose is generated by an LLM. But again, none of the decision making is done by the LLM. So everything progresses from step to step, like generate lore, generate story structure, the story arcs. What happens to the characters? What is the character arc or the story arc? All of that is deterministic, and it happens. The background, the code that governs it is deterministic. However, the story structure is actually still written by the LLM. So there can be some variance, but there are some feedback loops. But in the feedback loops within the story writing and the review part of the code, again, it's done by libraries that exist in the code and not by the LLM. So there are agents that act within this code, but they're deterministic, such as a story writing agent. Yes, the text generated is not fully deterministic. However, the review of that, and then there's a review agent which will then decide whether we have to rewrite some of the text. So in this scenario, in this app, it by design, I didn't want it to be fully agentic because I didn't think it made sense. I thought that this would be the right way to go in order to have an LLM generate a novel. Whether that's a good idea or not is another thing, but this is what I was trying to do. So I kind of made that clear, and that this diagram here is supposed to be the architecture of the app. So at the top level is the user interface. And then there's a story generation orchestrator, which basically controls the different sort of agents. And again, not AI agents, there's no decision making, but there is automation. And again, you can have the app generate the entire novel by itself, fully automated, until it gets to the end point that the novel is done. And the agents basically help it to get there. So I think this is a good example of one which is mostly deterministic. Obviously, the output will always be different each time because an LLM can produce a different story each time, but you can try to guide it to basically produce a similar sort of story. I mean, LLMs are non-deterministic. However, the amount of variation in their outputs is actually not that great. But that's for another video. I think I've even covered that in previous videos. Next up is RPG Loom. So RPG Loom is an idle RPG where you can perform certain tasks like hunting NPCs, mining and foraging, and this is all fully deterministic. There is actually no randomness in this game. And this was me testing out an idea to see, does it make sense to even try to add some sort of non-deterministic feature in here somewhere, but let everything else be fully deterministic? And it's been an interesting testbed for this experiment. What I've added is some sort of AI quest generation. So there's a little bit of text here that you can see whenever you generate a quest or an adventure, as I've called it here. The adventure is a bit like a daily quest. You click the button and it can generate a new quest for you. And then there's subtasks within there. And the AI writes the text for these tasks. However, the tasks themselves actually come from a template within the code, or various templates within the code. So you're asking the LLM to generate between 3 and 5 different subtasks for an adventure, and it has to make a decision on that. But you're only giving it a single prompt. You're not asking it to have lots of back and forth and to make decisions based upon basically prompt chaining. That's not what happens here. So whenever it generates tasks such as, go to this location and fight this monster, or go to this location and mine 5 silver or 5 iron or 5 gold or whatever it is, there has to be a way for it to know whether the task has been completed. But because it's fully deterministic, it's always easy to know whether those tasks have been completed, and therefore whether you can mark them off. So again, all of the tasks, all of the actions are fully deterministic. There isn't really much automation here. The AI part is just to generate the text around it and to make a decision as to which tasks to pull in and in which order. So that's where I could argue that this one isn't really agentic, but there is a little bit of LLM decision-making power, and there isn't really much autonomy here. Arguably, this one could have been the first example within my list. But let's move on. Now, this is Dungeon GPT. Dungeon GPT is my AI-powered dungeon master, as I've said before. So as you can see on the screen, you have a conversation with the LLM, and it leads you through a D&D scenario, basically. That's kind of the idea. It can take you through some sort of custom, RPG. You're talking to it, and it will guide you on the story. There are party members that are created within the app itself. So that's obviously fully deterministic to create the characters. They have stats, and that's remembered in the background. So that's kind of part of the memory of the game. The text, the story is also part of the memory that's all in the background that you don't see here in the back end of the app. And so when I'm designing this, I've been asking myself, do I try to make this more deterministic? Do I try to make the rules of the game fully encoded within the app, such that your characters will go towards a fight and then fight some monster, and there could be maybe a little bit of randomness thrown in there. However, all of the fights are basically predetermined, much like most games. If you go to something like Baldur's Gate 3, which is the one of the most sort of revered RPGs of the last few years, the story is all pre-written for you. There is branching in there, so the stories branch and different outcomes can happen, but the broad overarching story is always going to be the same. In what I've got here, the story can differ. That the LLM has some amount of power to decide where the story goes, so that's obviously quite different from what Baldur's Gate is. However, Baldur's Gate is obviously, it has deterministic systems in the background, such as whenever you're having a fight, there's combat, and it can roll the dice, which there's a little bit of randomness, but it has to follow quite strict rules, whereas an LLM does not. So you have to sort of provide rules to an LLM to try to guide it, but it can also go off the track. And so I'm trying to find out what is the right point between the determinism and the non-determinism, and then finding the right path in order to keep it fun. And I want to try to veer more towards the non-determinism side. However, it has to have some sort of guardrails to keep it in the right direction, and that's been quite tricky. And this is important whenever we're talking about quests, because you want the story to be coherent. You don't want it to be random. But at the same time, if you have a quest in an RPG, often there are sub-quests, there's parts to the quest. And that's something that I was thinking about. And this is something where I have something of a solution, and again, it's getting towards being an agentic pattern, perhaps without being properly agentic. I would say that the tests are working. I don't want to say that it's perfect, but it's in the right direction. So there's 2 boxes here on the left and the right. This is actually from the same page within my app. This is a testing page. So on the left, I'm showing you the campaign. And so there's a story that the AI wrote for the campaign, and then there's tasks within that the AI has also written. So you have to complete each task in turn in order to complete the overall mission. Now, the interesting thing here is that this is all in text. So you're sending text to the LLM and it has to make a decision about whether you have completed a task or not. And so it's no longer 1 + 1 = 2, but rather you have some sort of fuzzy input to the LLM, such as, I have killed the dragon, or I have used my sword to kill the dragon, I have used my axe to kill the dragon, I have used my bow and arrow to take a shot to hit it in the eye, which may or may not have killed the dragon. Please let me know what you think. So each of these are variations of a similar sort of idea where you're trying to kill a dragon, and you want to know whether the LLM can understand that and give you a response. And so it has to parse what you've said, make a decision, and then give you an output. And in the output can be, well, well done, great, you've completed your quest. However, you also need to have a way to parse the output in order to know whether that has happened. So your code has to know and be able to come up with a response that, yes, okay, you have passed the quest. And this is where I've added something called a marker. So there's a text marker here. As you can see, I'm trying to show you with my mouse, and it says complete campaign. This is something that the code in the app will parse and say, okay, the campaign has been completed, or the quest, the subtask has been completed. And this is really important. You can't just give back completely unformatted text without any of these markers, because it's too difficult perhaps for the code to give a reliable decision. So the code is kind of confirming whether the AI has made a decision or not. So you have to parse that and give the correct response, which is done here. In the bottom, I've called it a tool call. It maybe isn't technically a tool call the way that it's written, but I had that in my mind when I was thinking about tool calls and how I want this app to progress. I think it's an example of where we're getting quite close to having agentic, where you have back and forth, and that's kind of what happens with an agent. Again, it's the agent will go on some loop and it will keep working until it hits some sort of target goal, but it has to assess through the loop whether it's hit that target goal or not. And here we have something where we're going through a quest, not a loop, but the LLM has to check whenever you send it a prompt, it has to check whether some goal has been met or not. So it's kind of getting towards this autonomous agent, but it's not autonomous and it's not quite an agent, but it's got agentic patterns is what I'm saying. That's what I'm calling something which is kind of agent-like, but not being a full agent. So this I think is quite interesting, and it may be that when you're writing an app that this will make sense. So you've got something which has got agentic features or agentic patterns without being fully agentic. And there's good reasons for doing this. And again, it's how much determinism that you want to have in your app. And I suspect that in many situations, you do want something to be deterministic, that you probably don't want to have too much decision-making power done by the LLM. So let's go on to my last example. And this is something which is actually fully agentic from the beginning because it was designed to be agentic. So Story Daemon is an app that generates long-form fiction through an autonomous agent that plans, writes, and evolves the stories organically. So there are tools within this app that help it to do all of these things. And this has been designed from the beginning. So it is a CLI tool. As you can see here in the picture, it's not particularly pretty, but it's kind of just designed to do this sort of core task of writing. Essentially, it's like Novel Writer, but it's taking a different approach. Rather than the top-down that Novel Writer has, where it tries to structure the whole story before it writes, this one starts to write the story based upon some notion of where it wants to go. And then it tries to make decisions about whether it has to pull the story one way or other in order to get towards that end point. So let's dive into this a little bit more. I'm going to do another presentation about Story Daemon, I think, afterwards, where I go into far more detail than I do here. I want to keep this video a bit shorter by giving you a sort of a view across multiple apps that I've made that use agentic patterns in different ways in order to help guide you as to whether it makes sense to add an AI agent or not. And also to kind of encourage you that actually it's not that difficult to add some sort of agency or agentic pattern. You kind of just need to sit down and do it. you can ask an LLM to help you. So what are the tool calls? So the tool calls are functions that exist within the code that an LLM can call, and which triggers the function to do some action. And this is what is the bridge between the creative decisions of the LLM and the deterministic factual state of the story, the world state of the story. The world state would be the locations, the factions, the characters. Each of them will have facts that are true about them, such as a name, which could be John Smith. When you're writing the story, you want your character to always be called John Smith, and not for the name to magically change in the future to being, saying, Jane Smythe or Billy Bobson or whatever. It should always be the same name. It should always have the same age. It should always have the same facts. So whenever you're giving an LLM decision-making power, you want to have some sort of guardrails to help guide it, and that's where you have tools and tool calls in order to help guide the LLM in what it does, to keep it factual. Within this app, there is a vector database, and that's to aid with the semantic search, and that's one of the tool calls. The LLM can search the story of what exists in order to dig in clues, and these facts that are in the vector database go into the prompt, which are then pulled to the AI. So as I kind of said, you can create new entities. These are tool calls to create new entities, or you might want to update existing entities, such as a character will have a goal, and whenever it completes a goal, the LLM will make a decision about whether the character has completed a goal, and therefore whether it needs a new goal to follow. And in fact, there's actually can be multiple goals for each of your characters at any one time. And the last one just says query the story state, which I've kind of hinted upon with the there's a bit more detail about who knows who and kind of like the relationships and so on and so forth. So this is about trying to maintain data integrity while the story evolves, because the LM has the ability to evolve the story as it decides. So it's emergent story writing, and this is to try and prevent hallucinations and to ensure that everything's persistent across, which could be many, many scenes. I hope that was interesting. That's kind of pretty much everything that I wanted to say about the different apps that I've made. I think it is relatively easy to add agentic features to your apps, but there is some questions about when you want to do that and why you want to do that. And that's what I wanted to cover in this video, both to encourage you, but also to get you to question about whether you should do it. And in many cases, it doesn't make sense just to add in fully agentic features, but there are times when you want to. And perhaps when it really makes sense is whenever you design an app from the beginning to be fully agentic rather than just trying to bolt it on. So, thanks for watching. I hope you found that to be interesting. My channel covers a bunch of topics in and around AI, particularly, of course, with coding and creating apps, game development, and text generation, so writing novels or any sort of creative writing, and how I've been using AI to help me to do that. So I appreciate, of course, people liking and subscribing to the channel. I would really appreciate some comments too. I've not had too many comments yet, but it would also help to guide me and just to hear your thoughts, whether you like this sort of content and perhaps whether there's things that you want to learn. I can take some questions while there's not too many comments, and at the moment there isn't. If you're on GitHub, of course, then I would appreciate if you check out my GitHub repo, or repos, sorry, I should say. And if you send some stars towards them, that's always greatly appreciated. Okay, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.